4,300 people paid $12 apiece to stand in the heat at the Harlan County Fairgrounds that Saturday in August of 2019, and the general consensus among a good portion of them, formed within about 90 seconds of the first walkthrough, was that the woman in the denim work shirt standing next to the faded red Kenworth had made a wrong turn somewhere between the parking lot and the staging area. The truck was a 1979 W900. Long nose, high hood, the kind of cab-over-everything silhouette that Kenworth built when fuel economy was somebody else's problem and the American trucking industry still believed that a diesel engine should sound like it meant something. The hood was the original factory red, or had been once. 40 years of sun and weather had turned it the color of old brick, and there were places along the fender line where the paint had given up entirely, and the steel had gone the quiet brown of river iron. The exhaust stacks were aftermarket, slightly mismatched, one of them showing a weld repair that had been ground smooth but never painted. The tires were newer than the rest of the truck, which told you something if you were paying attention, and the chrome on the grille was more memory than fact. The woman's name was Darlene Caudle. She was 53 years old, 5'4", and she had the hands of someone who had been doing mechanical work since before most of the professional crew members across the staging area had been born. She was checking the front wheel hubs with the kind of focused, unhurried attention that suggested she had done this particular check several hundred times and did not intend to skip it today. 40 feet away, a machine called the Ironclad Express sat on its trailer and collected admiration. It belonged to a commercial pulling team out of Lexington, sponsored by 3 equipment manufacturers and an agricultural chemical company whose logo appeared in 4 places on the body panels. The engine package alone had cost $178,000. The truck had been built from a donor cab in an engineered shop with a CNC machine and a staff of 6, and it had won 11 regional events in the previous 2 seasons. The crew wore matching shirts. They had a generator-powered fan running to keep the intercooler temperatures down while they waited. One of them walked over to look at the Kenworth at some point during the staging period, stood there for a moment with his arms crossed, said something to the man beside him, and they both laughed. Darlene Caudle did not look up. Now, I need to stop here and tell you something about her, because without knowing who Darlene Caudle was before that Saturday in August, the rest of this story is just a truck pulling a sled down a strip of dirt, and it deserves to be more than that. Darlene grew up in Harlan County itself, which is the kind of geographic coincidence that feels like the story was written on purpose. Her father, Earl Caudle, had run a diesel repair operation out of a concrete block building on Route 119 for 31 years. Not a dealership, not a franchise. A shop with 4 bays, a parts room that smelled of rubber and old paper, and a reputation that stretched far enough that people drove from 3 counties over when they had something seriously wrong with a big engine and didn't trust anyone else to get inside it. Earl had learned engines the way people learned things before the internet, from manuals and mistakes and from the man who had taught him, who had himself learned in the same way going back another generation. The knowledge was inherited and layered and deeply personal. Darlene had been in that shop since she was 7 years old, not playing, working, handing tools, cleaning parts, watching. By the time she was 12, she could identify most common diesel failure modes by sound alone, which is a skill that sounds impractical until you're standing in a field at 2 in the morning with a machine that won't start and no diagnostic computer within 40 miles. By the time she was 16, she was doing her own oil analyses and keeping a notebook of measurements, bore diameter, valve clearance, injector timing offsets that she updated every time she worked on a familiar engine. She still had those notebooks. Several of them were in the cab of the W900 that morning. She had not planned to be a diesel mechanic. She had planned to be a lot of things, the way you do when you're young and the future feels like a menu. But her father's shop was what it was, and she was good at it in a way that was hard to walk away from, and at some point the decision made itself. She took over the operation in 2004 when Earl's vision started going and his hands started shaking, and she ran it for 11 years before the combination of a bad economic stretch in the county and a new dealership that opened 12 miles up the road made the math impossible. She closed the shop in 2015. She was not bitter about it. She was practical. She had seen the numbers coming for 2 years and had prepared accordingly. What she had not prepared for was what to do with the time. She had bought the W900 in 2016 from an estate sale in Bell County. The man who had owned it had been a long-haul driver who had pulled the truck off the road in 1994 when the miles finally caught up with the original engine, and then had kept it in a barn for 22 years because he couldn't bring himself to sell it and couldn't afford to rebuild it. His family had no use for it. Darlene had paid $4,200 for it, which was honest money for what it was, a complete truck with a salvageable drivetrain and a cab that was structurally sound, if not particularly beautiful. She had spent 2 years and a little over $8,000 additional bringing it back, not restoring it. She was careful about that distinction. Restoration would have meant returning it to what it was. What Darlene built was something different, something that looked like what it was on the outside and was something else entirely underneath, which, if you thought about it, was a fairly accurate description of Darlene Caudle herself. Now, I need you to stay with me for a few minutes, because this is the part that explains everything that happened on that strip. This is the intellectual key, and without it, you're watching a truck move down a dirt track. With it, you're watching a thesis get proven. The engine in the Ironclad Express was a purpose-built competition unit, a 14-liter inline-six pushing somewhere north of 3,000 horsepower at peak output. That number is real, and it is enormous. And when that engine was at full song, it sounded like something being torn apart at the molecular level. The crew was proud of it. They had reason to be. At the top of its power band, at the RPM range where it made its maximum output, there was almost nothing on a stock pulling circuit that could match it on raw numbers. Here's what those numbers don't tell you. A truck pull is not a drag race. A truck pull is not a test of maximum horsepower. A truck pull is a test of sustained low-speed force against a progressively increasing load, because the sled that the truck is pulling uses a weight transfer system that makes the effective resistance heavier with every foot of forward travel. At the start of the pull, the load is manageable. At 100 feet, it is serious. At 200 feet, it is enormous. At a full pull, it is, in the most literal mechanical sense, everything the truck has. What that means in engineering terms is this. The engine that wins a pull is not the engine with the highest peak horsepower. It is the engine with the most torque at the lowest possible RPM. Because as the load increases, the engine must maintain forward motion without climbing into a higher power band. It must pull through the resistance at the bottom of its curve, where the force is steady and sustainable, not at the top, where the force is spectacular but brief. This is the difference between a draft horse and a racehorse. A racehorse is built for speed. It generates tremendous power at full gallop, But if you put a racehorse in front of a loaded plow and ask it to pull through heavy ground at a walking pace, it will struggle, because that is not where its strength lives. A draft horse, a Percheron, a Belgian, a Clydesdale, is built for exactly that kind of work. It generates its maximum force at low speed, leaning into the collar, the muscles of its hindquarters driving straight through the ground, not spinning, not rushing, just moving forward with the kind of patient, relentless authority that the racehorse cannot match in that context. Darlene Caudle had built a draft horse. The engine in the W900 was a Cummins NTC 855 Big Cam 4, which is a 14-liter inline-six that Cummins produced through the late 1970s and 1980s, and which became one of the most respected large-displacement diesel engines in the history of American trucking. Not because it was the most powerful, because it was the most torque-dense at low RPM of anything in its class. The Big Cam 4 in stock configuration made somewhere around 400 horsepower. What it also made, and what made it different from almost everything else, was 1,450 foot-pounds of torque at 1,200 revolutions per minute. 1,900 revolutions per minute below where most competition engines made their peak power. At the bottom of the curve, where the sled resistance was trying to stop the truck cold, the Big Cam 4 was still pulling. Darlene had not left it in stock configuration. Over the course of those 2 years in her barn, she had rebuilt the engine from the bare block. She had gone to 0.030 over on the bores, fitted new pistons with a slightly elevated compression ratio, replaced the camshaft with a unit she had sourced from a machine shop in Indiana that reground profiles for pulling applications, and had the injectors rebuilt and recalibrated to a higher delivery rate by a man in Knoxville who had been doing injector work since the Carter administration. She had fitted a single large turbocharger, not a compound twin-turbo arrangement like the Ironclad was running, but a single unit chosen specifically for its spool characteristics at low shaft speed, which meant it built boost early and held it steadily rather than peaking and falling. She had gone through the fuel system with the same attention she had given every other component, adjusting timing and delivery until the numbers in her notebook matched the numbers in her head. She had also done something that the Ironclad's crew would not have thought to do, because it required a kind of knowledge that doesn't come with a budget. She had dyno-tested the engine at 3 different ambient temperatures, mapped its torque curve at each one, and then used that data to set the final injection timing for an August afternoon in eastern Kentucky. She knew what the air density would be. She had checked the forecast. She had done this calculation on a piece of paper with a pencil, the same way her father had taught her. The total cost of the engine build was $6,400, including the Knoxville injector work and the Indiana camshaft and every gasket and seal and fastener she had replaced along the way. The transmission behind it was a rebuilt Fuller Road Ranger 13-speed that she had gone through herself, with a custom gear ratio final drive that she had sourced from a differential shop in Corbin. She had chosen the gear ratio with the same logic she had applied to everything else. Not for top speed, not for peak power, but for the specific combination of road speed and engine RPM that would put the Big Cam 4 in its torque peak when the sled resistance was at its worst. She had spent 2 years building a machine that would be strongest at exactly the moment when strength mattered most. Now, I need to take you back to that fairground, because it's getting close to the time when all of this stops being theory. The temperature at the Harlan County Fairgrounds at 11:40 that Saturday morning was 87 degrees, which was within 2 degrees of what Darlene had planned for. The track was compacted clay, dry at the edges, darker in the center where the morning's earlier pulls had worked the surface. The grandstands were full. The smell of the place was diesel exhaust and cut grass, and the specific sweet acrid combination of burning rubber and hot brake dust that accumulates over a full morning of pull-in events. People were eating. Children were running along the fence line. A man in a lawn chair near the timing booth had a radio on his knee playing something country and not recent. There was a boy at the fence near the staging area, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing a cap with a tractor brand on it and watching everything with the total attention that children bring to things that have ninely interest them. He had been watching Darlene work on the Kenworth for most of the morning. At some point, he asked her, through the chain link, which one was going to win. Darlene looked up from what she was doing. She looked at the boy for a moment. Then she looked at the ironclad express sitting gleaming on its trailer 40 feet away, and then back at the boy. "Depends on what you mean by win," she said, and went back to work. The ironclad express pulled first as the defending regional points leader. The crew ran it through a warm-up cycle, the engine coming up through its registers with a sound that was genuinely impressive. A rising layered note that went from a diesel rumble into something closer to a mechanical scream as the RPMs climbed. People stood up. Several phones came out. The ironclad hooked to the sled at 12:07 p.m. The chain went taut with a single sharp metallic note, and the truck launched hard, the rear tires biting into the clay and throwing a rooster tail of dark soil for the first 30 feet before they found their grip. The ironclad pulled to 287 feet. That was a serious number. That was the kind of number that wins regional events. The crew did not celebrate extravagantly, but they did not need to. The crowd did it for them, and the number on the board was its own statement. The man who had laughed looking at Darlene's truck looked at the board, then looked across the staging area, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has already decided the outcome of something. Darlene Caudle was checking her tires. She had checked them before the ironclad pulled. She checked them again now. She walked around the truck slowly, the way she always did, putting her hand on each corner, feeling the temperature of the sidewall with her palm. She checked the hitch connection. She checked the turbo boost line that she had rerouted the previous week. She opened the hood and looked at the engine for a moment, not checking anything specific, just looking, the way you look at something you know well before you ask it to do something hard. She put her hand flat on the valve cover. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she closed the hood. At 12:43 p.m., the W900 was called to the line. The crowd noise dropped in a specific way when the old Kenworth rolled into the staging area. Not into silence, but into a kind of curious murmur, the sound of several thousand people trying to decide what they were looking at. The truck was visually incongruous in a way that was hard to ignore. Everything else that had pulled that morning was either purpose-built or heavily modified in ways that announced themselves, shiny, loud, aggressive in appearance. The W900 looked like it had come from a farm. It looked like something's grandfather. Several people in the grandstands laughed, not cruelly, but with the easy confidence of people who were certain they knew what was about to happen. Darlene backed the truck to the sled hook. She got out, connected the chain herself, checked the connection twice, and got back in. The engine had been running at idle for 11 minutes. The exhaust note at idle was a low, even cadence. Not spectacular, not loud, just steady, like a clock that meant what it said. The turbo was spooling at low pressure, the boost gauge reading in a range that looked conservative to anyone who had been watching the ironclad's gauges earlier in the morning. Darlene brought the RPMs up, not to the top of the range, but to 1,400, right at the base of the torque peak where the big Cam 4 was already making the force it was built to make. She let the clutch out. The truck moved from the line the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar. Without drama, without noise beyond the engine note climbing through the low registers, the tires finding the ground and keeping it. There was no wheel spin. There was no rooster tail. The rear tires compressed into the clay and stayed there, the lugs pressing into the surface with steady, even force, and the truck moved forward at a walking pace that was deliberate and absolute. At 50 feet, the crowd was quiet. Not the quiet of boredom, the quiet of people who had expected something to fail, and were watching it not fail, and were not quite sure yet what to do with that information. The engine note had not changed significantly. The RPMs had dropped slightly as the sled resistance increased from 1,400 to 1,280, which put the engine exactly where Darlene had calculated it would be, not fighting the load by climbing the power band, but absorbing it at the bottom, where the torque was greatest and the force was most sustainable. At 100 feet, the exhaust stacks began to show color, not the white of a cold engine or the black of a rich overload, but a deep gray that went blue at the edges, which is the color of a diesel engine working at the exact boundary of its calibrated fuel delivery. The turbo note was audible now, a steady whistle beneath the engine's low song, not rising and falling, but holding. The boost pressure steady at a number Darlene had chosen for this specific temperature and this specific load. At 150 feet, people in the grandstands were standing up, not all at once. In the way that crowds stand when something is happening that they hadn't planned to stand for, one person, then three, then a row, then the row behind it, the movement spreading outward from the people who understood what they were seeing to the people who were standing because the people in front of them were standing, and something was clearly happening. At 200 feet, the W900 passed the point where most of the morning's other competitors had stopped. The chain was singing now, a high metallic vibration that was audible even over the engine, and the sled's weight transfer mechanism had moved the ballast far enough forward that the effective resistance was somewhere in the range of what physics allows at the outer edge of traction. The rear axle was loaded to its absolute limit. The frame of the old Kenworth was flexing in the way that steel flexes when it is being asked to carry more than it was designed to carry, and the sound of the chassis working was part of the engine's note now, a harmonic that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. At 240 feet, the crowd was making a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite silence, but something in between. A collective, held breath that had been going on for 30 seconds and was beginning to release in small bursts, individual voices breaking through the tension before the group found its voice. At 287 feet, Darlene Caudle's 1979 Kenworth W900 passed the mark where the ironclad express had stopped, and it kept going. That is the sentence that matters. It kept going. The engine note did not change. The tires did not spin. The RPMs had settled at 1,150, below the peak of the torquey curve, but still on the curve, still generating force. The big Cam 4 doing exactly what it had been built to do in exactly the conditions it had been built to do it in. The crowd found its voice somewhere around the 290-foot mark, and the sound that came out of those grandstands was the sound of 4,000 people revising an assumption they had held for the previous 4 hours. At 312 feet, the truck slowed. Not stopped, slowed, the engine pulling against a load that had finally exceeded the available traction, the tires beginning to find the edge of their grip on the clay. Darlene held it in gear for another 3 seconds, the engine working at the absolute bottom of what it could do, every pound of force it could generate going into the chain going into the sled pressing into the ground. Then she let it breathe. 312 feet, 25 feet past the ironclad express. The crowd was not quiet anymore. Darlene shut the engine down and sat in the cab for a moment. Through the windshield, she could see the timing booth and the number going up on the board, and she could see the grandstands, and she could see the ironclad's crew standing near their trailer with expressions that had undergone a significant revision from the ones they had been wearing an hour earlier. She got out of the truck. She walked around to the rear and looked at the tires, checking the tread wear and the sidewall temperature the same way she had checked them before the pull. Then she walked to the front and put her hand on the hood. The engine was ticking as it cooled, a sound she had been listening to for 3 years, and she stood there with her hand on the warm steel and let it tick. The crew chief from the ironclad came over about 10 minutes later. He was a tall man in his 40s, and he came without the man who had laughed, which said something about his judgment. He stood next to the Kenworth and looked at the engine compartment for a moment, then looked at Darlene. "What's she making?" he said. "Enough," Darlene said. He nodded. He put his hand on the fender, just briefly, the way you touch something you've come to respect. "That cam," he said. It wasn't a question. "Partly," she said. He nodded again. "Hooted your injectors," she told him. He wrote the name down in his phone. Then he looked at the truck one more time. The faded red hood, the mismatched stacks, the weld repair that had never been painted, and he said, "She doesn't look like what she is." "No," Darlene said. "She doesn't." He went back to his trailer. The boy at the fence had watched all of it. He was still there when Darlene walked back past the chain link, and he had the expression of someone who has just seen something that has permanently rearranged his understanding of how things work. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You knew, didn't you?" Before it started. Darlene looked at him. "I knew what I built," she said. She went back to checking the truck. Here is something worth knowing about what happened after that Saturday. The ironclad's crew did visit Darlene's barn. Not that week, but 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday in October when the leaves in Harlan County had gone to gold and red, and the air had the specific cold clarity of early fall in the mountains. The crew chief came with one of his younger mechanics, a kid in his mid-20s who had been asking questions since August. They spent 4 hours in that barn. Darlene showed them the notebooks. She showed them the dyno sheets, the timing calculations, the injector calibration records. She showed them the camshaft spec sheet from the Indiana shop and explained why she had chosen that particular grind for those particular conditions. The young mechanic said, at one point, that he hadn't known you could get that kind of torque curve out of an engine that old. Darlene handed him one of the notebooks. "You can get it out of anything," she said, "if you understand what you're asking it to do." The W900 is still in Darlene's barn. She drives it occasionally, not to events, just on the county roads around her property, the way you drive something that you've built a relationship with, for the pleasure of the relationship. The engine sounds the same as it did on that Saturday in August. The hood is still the color of old brick. She has not painted it. She is still in Harlan County. She does some consulting work now, diesel diagnostics for farms and small operators who can't afford dealership rates and need someone who will actually look at the engine rather than plug in a computer and read what the computer says. She drives a 2003 pickup with 240,000 miles on it that she maintains herself, and the maintenance records for that truck are kept in a notebook in the glove box, updated in the same handwriting as the notebooks from the W900 rebuild. She did not enter another pulling event. She had made the point she wanted to make, and she was not interested in making it twice. The ground at the Harlan County Fairgrounds doesn't know what anything cost. The compacted clay on that strip doesn't care about sponsor logos or matching crew shirts or the number on a build invoice. It only knows what the chain tells it, and the chain only knows what the engine can sustain at the moment when the load is greatest, and the margin for anything less than everything has gone to zero. That is the only test that matters. Everything else is preparation. Darlene Caudle prepared. If this story found you the way it found the people standing in those grandstands that day, if it started as one thing and became something else by the time it was over, I want to hear about it. And more than that, I want to hear your version of it. Because there is a Darlene Caudle in every county in this country. There is someone working in a barn or a shop or a garage right now, with notebooks and old tools and a machine that doesn't look like what it is, building something that the people with the money and the matching shirts have not thought to build. If you know that person, or if you are that person, put it in the comments. Tell me what they built and what it did, and who was standing there when it happened. I read every single one of those comments, and I mean that without qualification. This channel exists because of those stories. Every week there is another one, another machine that wasn't supposed to work, another person who was supposed to step aside, another strip of dirt or track or field that settled an argument nobody expected to be settled. If you want to be here when those stories come out, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one, someone who's in the middle of the barn work right now, in the part of the project where it's cold and the numbers aren't adding up, and the people who laughed haven't stopped laughing yet, send it to them. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody passes them on. The engine is still ticking in that barn in Harlan County. It will tick for a long time yet. That's what it means to build something right.